What's up, Robert?
Hello. Hey,
How
how
are
you
you?
doing, Nick? I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. Yeah, thanks for jumping on. This is actually the last, one-on-one of the day. We've still got an impressive number of people on that have stuck around all day, so that's good. I think people are probably excited to hear from you. And we've talked a little bit about Polkadot throughout the day. We've kind of talked about this progression from Bitcoin to then Ethereum came next, and Ethereum now has kind of clear product market fit for DeFi, and we're constantly thinking about what comes next after that. And I think Polkadot could be that, right? And we've talked a little bit today about authenticity, right? And looking for authentic teams that are truly innovating, right? I think the thing about crypto that's hard for people that aren't paying close attention is that everything's open source and can be easily copied, and so it's kind of hard to tell what's the real thing and what's a fork with a slight marketing change, right? And next gen blockchains have been a a meme for the past 3 years, and there's been a lot of projects and a lot of money thrown at these projects that are trying to be what comes next after Ethereum, right? And I think what Robert and Gav have done with Polkadot is they're kind of authentic innovators that are kind of at the forefront of the space. And so, Robert, why don't you tell the group a little bit just about your personal story of and what led you to start working on Polkadot?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. Before that, I'd love to touch on that point that you brought up about innovation and sort of next gen blockchains, because I think that is something really important with the state of the research advancing so fast, and how fast researchers can innovate on paper and tweak protocols. I think one of the skills that we really have at our disposal within Polkadot is to pick a target, and the state of the art of research is always going to be moving faster than the state of art of what you can actually implement, especially when it comes to larger systems. So, that's a lot of the methodology. And I think that's where Gav and I come from, is from this developer background of, having academic understanding, but also bringing that into hit targets that are based around code and actually shipping products. Um, to return to the introduction, my background is in computer security and cryptography, and that's how I was first introduced to Bitcoin. I'd say back in 2011 or 12. I started to work on the Rust programming language in 2013. So I was, it was billed to me when I saw it advertised as solving many of these security issues, the same exact types of attacks that I would use in challenges and competitions, and when looking into software. So of course it was a natural fit, and through my Bitcoin exposure, I was also exposed to Ethereum when that project was starting. So Gav broke off from the Ethereum Foundation to start Ethcore, which built the Parity Ethereum client back in the end of 2015. And shortly after that, I was aware of Parity, which was working on Ethereum in Rust. And it was sort of the intersection of two big interests for me, of this blockchain technology, cryptography, anonymous payments, combined with, I think tooling that's really good for writing this type of software, for writing fast software, for writing software that's going to be resilient to attack, and that will scale very well. So with that, I sort of reached out and started to work with the team at Parity on building the Parity Ethereum client. I was an Ethereum core developer within 2016 and 2017. And during that time, I was working with Gavin and Peter Chaban on the design of Polkadot's parachains, which are the fundamental scaling primitive of Polkadot, how we're going to shard the blockchain and split transactions across many different shards. So I'm sure we're going to go into that in more detail later, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Got it. Cool. Well, the audience isn't super technical, so we probably won't go too deep into that. But maybe talk about what the big problems, or not necessarily problems, right? Because Ethereum is working well, but issues with Ethereum that you thought could be improved. Maybe talk about that and how. I mean, there's certainly been a lot of narratives, right, in terms of scalability and in terms of developer experience and things like that. But maybe just describe what you saw that was maybe holding Ethereum back, that you thought could be improved upon.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I think one thing that really is at the core of the blockchain space is about democratizing access to rules and rule making, to let people create their own rules and their own games that have to be abided by. It's not, within that you can create games like games for spending money quickly and anonymously and things like that, use cases that we've already seen with finance. But there is, of course, a big scalability problem. This is the one that I think gets addressed most on the surface level, which is what we see is on Ethereum, on the proof of work blockchain in particular, the transaction throughput is simply just not high. It's costly to get transactions in. But I think one of the maybe less recognized components of this is that, and one of the things that we're trying to solve with Polkadot is that most of the blockchain offerings on the public market are trying to do everything at once, like blockchains that are trying to be like balance transfers and also provide security and also do smart contracts and also do this and that, and trying to be extremely general. And on paper you can say, well, this system is Turing complete. Theoretically it could compute any type of transaction, but of course we see that the actual computational limits of these systems are in practice lower. And one thing that's important to know and to recognize is that when you can specialize to a specific problem domain, you can customize, what does a transaction actually mean, right? Like we talk a lot about transactions per second, but obviously, there's different granularities of transactions. Some transactions might be heavier than others, or for different things, like to say, do a file storage operation, or to send data to an oracle, or to participate in a DeFi lending platform. So those types of things. And if you can build a blockchain that serves one specific purpose, it can optimize to do that one type of transaction or a few types of transactions very, very well. Now, of course, if you had this blockchain completely in isolation, it would be pretty much useless, right? Like let's say you had a blockchain that didn't do transfers, but it only did lending, or it only did oracles, right? You had this sit on its own and nobody could really use it for anything. So the network effects and the ability for different use cases to interoperate and to work together is sort of the last piece of the puzzle, right? So first, we want to make it easy for people to write specialized purpose-built blockchains to get security for those blockchains so that they don't have to worry about gathering a miner community, which is another issue that we've seen is difficult because these things can be 51% attacked. And lastly, to connect these blockchains so you can have use cases that are emergent among many specific utilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think you did a very good job explaining that, although, some people on here may not kind of be as deep as us. So, I mean, really what you're talking about is application specific chains that are connected, right? And that, to understand that, you also need to understand the current construction of Ethereum, which is every application lives on the Ethereum blockchain, right? And there's issues with that. So if you look at the decentralized exchanges, for example, that are having tremendous traction on Ethereum right now, they're all on Ethereum, and the reason that fees are so high and transactions are so slow is because they're all on Ethereum, right? So the idea behind Polkadot at a high level is, what if we could create application-specific chains that all connect and communicate with each other, right? And this is really the holy grail in crypto. If you could have interconnected blockchains, and even if you look now at decentralized trading, you know, a lot of the highest value tokens are not ERC20 tokens and aren't really traded on DEXs yet, right? So when can we have a world when Bitcoin is able to communicate with Ethereum, which is able to communicate with Polkadot, and so on and so forth, right? That's what you guys are building, and I think it's an exciting vision at a high level. Maybe talk about kind of in practice where that is, right? You launched, you know, the Polkadot network last summer. We've seen some, you know, some parachains, I think, start connecting to the Kusama network, which was the Canary network. Talk a little bit about just the.
Not just yet, yeah, but quite soon, yeah. For sure, I'll guide you through what's already happened. Like we've been developing this project since mid to late 2017 was when we first really started writing code for it. And what we built was, we didn't want to just go out there and say, hey, we're going to build a project where you can build a blockchain and then connect it to the network, but then not really make it clear to teams how to actually do that. So what we've really built is two things. We've built the Polkadot network itself. We've also built what is effectively a blockchain SDK called Substrate that can be used to write any kind of blockchain, whether it connects to Polkadot or not. So it's being used in, by other teams. It's being used by enterprises, but it's also being used by us personally to write Polkadot. It's being used for many teams to write their own blockchains that they will connect to Polkadot. But we've also developed the Polkadot network, and in May of last year, the network went live. Over the next couple of months, it was sort of a gradiated launch. So first it started with the Web3 Foundation having control of the network, and then Web3 Foundation gave up control of that network, and then the tokens became transferable in August. So we're coming to the point where the parachains code is complete, and there's quite a lot to follow on GitHub there. I do refrain from giving specific times and estimates in public, so I will just tell you that we have certain metrics that you can watch, such as the Rococo test network, which is a live test network where there are already community parachains connecting, I believe 6 right now, and we're undergoing a lot of further optimization work and plucking some of those low-hanging fruits to make it scale up even more.
And you're leading you've been leading the parachains code, right?
Yeah, I've been working very closely with some of the researchers from the Web3 Foundation who provide a lot of work on the theoretical side of things. So that's namely Jeffrey Burgess and Alistair Stewart, but I'm leading the actual development of that research and collaborating with those researchers.
Very cool, very cool. So I think, yeah, go ahead. Did you have?
Yeah, well, just to follow up on your earlier question about interconnected blockchains, I think that there's a couple of important distinctions to make. So one is we want to make a distinction between communication that happens within the Polkadot network, so that is chains that are native on Polkadot. We kind of think of Polkadot as a layer 0 chain where people can deploy their own layer 1 chains within that bubble, and everything within that bubble gets more or less instantaneous communication with each other with, say, latency of 1 block or 2. Everything outside of the bubble, so that would be your existing layer 1 chains, things like Bitcoin, things like Ethereum, you do need two-way bridges to. But the key thing is that they don't need to make a bridge to every single chain within the Polkadot network bubble. They only need to have one bridge to Polkadot network, and then everything gets access to each other. So we have done quite a lot of research in terms of making the Polkadot network easy to bridge to and from, particularly for the use case of moving tokens. And that's primarily in terms of making it easy for other blockchains to interpret the state of Polkadot. However, those other blockchains need to have some kind of component on them which is viable for bridging. So on Ethereum, that's quite easy to do because you just deploy a smart contract to do it that implements the Ethereum side of the bridge. For Bitcoin, you would need probably to employ slightly different solutions because I don't think you're going to get a Bitcoin hard fork in anytime soon. But you will be able to do things like TBTC or wrapped BTC or other means like that to get access to Bitcoin on the Polkadot network.
Got it. So Ethereum is kind of taking ETH 2.0 and the roadmap is taking a similar construction of kind of sharded chains that connect, right, to a relay chain. So it seems like, you know, in that sense, it could be just a matter of who executes quicker. But there are also some other fundamental, I think, kind of differences that you know, Polkadot has relative to Ethereum, right? And to me, the biggest is governance, right? And I know that you know, you and Gav kind of, you know, believe in this kind of radical on-chain governance, and you know, Vitalik has kind of you know, famously no, I think he increasingly thinks it's interesting, actually, it seems like, but he's been more about governance minimization. And so why don't you tell people about that? We talked, actually, I don't know if you saw the chat with Cuban earlier, but we were talking a little bit about this idea of Polkadot governance and, you know, what comes next, and related to, you know, a blog post he wrote 15 years ago about how if you own a stock, you don't really have any rights, right? Which is kind of similar in Bitcoin and ETH right now. And you know, could we get to a world where when people own cryptocurrency, they want to have rights, and that could be what Polkadot looks like in the future, right?
Yeah, definitely. Like, what we want in this space is more experimentation, and also more, in a way, more discretion. So I always love the way that Eric Weinstein described the blockchain space, which is that, you know, if you watch a lot of sci-fi movies from the 80s, you see the example of a human ripping off its face and revealing that there's a computer underneath. Whereas the blockchain world is actually powered by humans. You have computers, that's what it appears to be on the surface, ripping off their faces and revealing that the structures are actually human, and that blockchains are really powered by a broader social contract. You know, I mean, even something like Bitcoin, it just conforms to the first rule of value, that things have value because people believe they have value. So where I'm going with this is that we have to acknowledge that these are ultimately human organizations, and whether or not you codify the rules of engagement, it doesn't mean that power structures that control the means of direction of a blockchain or a system do not exist. So what we've gone more towards is the explicit recognition of those rules on Polkadot, and using that to iterate a little bit more quickly. To do things like forkless upgrades of the blockchain, where there's no fork necessary to upgrade the logic to a new version, where these things have to pass referenda by dot holders. And it's going to give dot holders more power in the long term. I think one of the really interesting aspects too is that because of these forkless upgrades, the governance rules that are maintained on chain can actually be upgraded themselves. So what Polkadot is actually a meta protocol. It's not a fixed set of rules, it's a dynamic set of rules that constantly encodes the means by which the rules can be changed. So as research develops on many fronts, whether that's on the governance front or on the technology front, Polkadot's going to be able to stay current. It's not going to rust in the way that other blockchains do, because, you know, it's going to be able to cope with the chaos by bringing in that human element.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And maybe talk for people that don't know more specifically about how exactly that works, right? Like, as a dot holder, you know, what are your rights in the system, and how can you, you know, if users, you know, want to change, how can they get that done? Because, you know, what I always say is, like, I think Bitcoin and Ethereum effectively have the same governance, right? Which is rough consensus, and changes require the approval of users, developers, and miners, right? And Ethereum, the difference is Ethereum has a benevolent dictator that's still around and can, you know, catalyze, you know, agreement, and Bitcoin doesn't, right? So for that reason, Bitcoin has kind of stayed relatively stagnant, and Ethereum has been pretty slow, but still is pushing forward change, right? So talk about how that, like tactically, that could be different in Polkadot.
Yeah, well, I'll give a little bit of background on the actual governing bodies and sort of key
Yeah.
features of governance that exist within Polkadot. So primarily, you have you have the dot holders themselves, and the dot holders by referendum on chain can accomplish pretty much anything. They have what we would call root power or super user power, that anything that actually upgrades the logic of the chain has to go through the user base. Now there's a mechanism called adaptive quorum biasing, which essentially is about modulating the level of majority needed to pass based on turnout. So, if there's a very, very small turnout, you need an overwhelming majority in order to get something passed. Whereas if you had full turnout, it would take only 51%. Simple majority. There's also the council. So the council consists of a certain number of seats of sort of delegates elected by a form of ranked choice voting. And what the council gets to do is essentially set the defaults, the status quo of certain referendum, not all of them, but some of them. It also has the ability to control how funds are spent from the treasury, which is the next key component that I find super interesting. So in most blockchains, you have a certain amount of issuance of tokens at every block in order to pay miners or stakers to incentivize them. And I think back in 2016, we saw one of the first examples of starting to play with that in Zcash, where Zcash gave out a founder's reward of some percentage of the block reward to the founders. Well, in Polkadot, there's a percentage of the issuance every block that goes into the treasury. So there's just this, it's effectively a DAO that's governed by the council or by the referenda to determine how funds are spent. So what this is going to be used for example, is to fund projects that are more like common good to the Polkadot ecosystem. Things like wallets or design work or brand ambassadorship are examples of how it's already been used in the past. For things that don't necessarily have like viable business cases on their own, but clearly do create value for the ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. This is one of the most interesting things to me that's going on in crypto right now, right? I think a lot of people have been excited about this idea of DAOs and allowing the people to more efficiently fund public goods or also potentially private projects, right? And we've seen attempts. We've also seen some of the downsides of things like the Ethereum Foundation that have been notoriously slow and kind of bureaucratic in funding projects and potentially stifling development and innovation there. So maybe talk a little more. I think there's some interesting projects that are now getting funded through the treasury, right? And the way that works for people who don't understand is, anyone can propose something, right? And it's a matter of, the council approving it and the dot holders not rejecting it effectively, right? So maybe talk through practically. I think this is one of the coolest things, happening right now. I think it's kind of not super well known. So I think people would be interested in hearing more.
It's definitely one of the most intriguing parts of Polkadot, and I think one of the places it's going to have the most leverage. One particular example, which is interesting to me, is the Polkascan Block Explorer. So that's a site where you can inspect data from the blockchain. And what Emil, the founder of that project, has done is essentially he's written up a document that he refers to as the social contract between Polkascan and the Polkadot network. And what that culminates in effectively is a bill every month being sent to the Polkadot treasury for the maintenance and upkeep and continued development of this this block explorer. There are also wallet projects that have been funded, and there are a couple different types of funding that can be done through the treasury. So the first most simple way is to simply make a proposal to the treasury and request a certain amount of funds. And you have to put down a proportional deposit in order to do that. But anybody can make a request. And the second way is more of an RFP style bounties funding mechanism, where the Polkadot community or council will identify specific needs and put out a specific amount of funding, as well as what is effectively an RFP, request for proposals, to implement that, as well as appointing a curator to oversee the proposals to fulfill that bounty and to oversee the work that's done on it. And the first major example of a bounty that I find really interesting is a bounty that's been awarded to, or is in the process of being executed, has not been fully awarded, to Koto Design Studios for a rebranding of the Polkadot network. So I think this is interesting because it ties back into the concept of what we would call headless brands. Like in a traditional LLC or company, your company owns the trademark, your company owns the brand, and you sort of give that out and let people look at it and connect it back to your company. Whereas we can see like the Bitcoin and Ethereum brands and what we've got in this decentralized environment is very headless. There's no leader you can pinpoint exactly for who designed the Bitcoin logo or who owns that, or likewise for I think on a lesser extent of many other chains that exist for things like Ethereum and Zcash, where there are foundations that own the trademarks. But in Polkadot, instead of say the Web3 Foundation or Parity Technologies, who are some of the main actors involved in the Polkadot ecosystem, just paying a designer to do it, the Polkadot network has put out a bounty so that this rebranding is subject to the entire Polkadot network. It's not just work that's being paid for by some party that happens to be part of the network. I think this is one of the first examples of the ways that property and common goods are going to be paid for by the Treasury itself.
Got it. And you're a council member, correct?
Yeah, that's right. As of fairly recently, as of a couple weeks ago.
Got it. And you're one of 12 or 13?
Yeah, 13.
Okay. And just so people have a sense, I mean, there's a significant amount of capital now that needs to be behind you to be voted as a council member, right?
Yeah, I don't remember the exact figure, but it's definitely in the millions of dollars in terms of dots.
Right. Got it. One of the things I'm interested in is voting broadly, right? I think a lot of people saw the U.S. election and questions about the integrity of voting and things like that, and it just ties to, I think, a general trend of increasing distrust in institutions broadly. And people talk about blockchains used for voting, right? And my view is kind of, I don't think the existing institutions are necessarily going to implement blockchains efficiently for that purpose. But I do see, organic communities emerging that are utilizing it, right? And Polkadot seems to me like the fertile ground for that. And so the governance that Polkadot implements is also kind of a module for any cryptocurrency project to run this type of governance, right? And is that something that is interesting to you? Do you think that could be widely used, especially in the context of governance tokens in Ethereum right now, right? Which it's interesting to me that governance tokens have kind of emerged as this thing in Ethereum, and Ethereum doesn't really believe in governance, or at least it hasn't been built on that. So it seems like some of these governance projects, at least, are kind of exist for maybe as a regulatory hack rather than you know, a project that truly cares about governance, right? So talk about that.
Yeah, there's a few things to unpack. It is true that the governance code that's been written for Polkadot is simply accessible to other projects or other code bases as a module. And we see that, in fact, parachains are using those modules for governance as well. And I think one thing that's also interesting is that parachains actually act as full-fledged accounts within the Polkadot ecosystem. So you can have parachains exist as council members on the council, where actually they're just sort of like a blob council member that actually represents, you know, some further community of a specific parachain within that. So those don't have to be humans or even like regular accounts on the blockchain. That can be parachains themselves. We're also going to see a bunch of different things. I worked with some projects on the idea of, well, to give a little bit of background, the parachains rent slots from Polkadot. They provide dots for a lease, and then after the term, the lease is up and they get the dots back. There are other methods, for example, of using governance or treasuries to buy dots over time to ensure that the parachain actually owns dots and can continue to secure its lease. With respect to governance tokens that we've seen already, I do think that in many cases they are a regulatory hack and are priced at some proportion of expected cash flows if there were to be a vote that gave cash flows to token holders. However, I think, you know, one interesting thing about tokens in general, and questions that we often ask about tokens is like, well, why does this project need a token? I like the way that Hasu put it recently, which is that tokens transplant value from the future to the present by effectively allowing you to place a bet on a team. And I think one thing that comes to fruition with treasuries and with on-chain governance is the concept of mergers and acquisitions, that, you know, a treasury could actually be used to buy out another protocol. And thus you could literally have tokens that are just used for nothing but speculation in the first place. And you're upfront about it. These are sort of like pre-liquidity event shares of a decentralized protocol that are issued via crowdfunding or some other mechanism, and eventually will be bought out by a treasury if that provides utility to the network. You know, I think people are investigating these kinds of mechanisms, and there's a lot that can happen when you have when you really lean into this this treasury-oriented mode of organizing capital.
Got it. We've got a couple more minutes. I'm not sure if there's questions here. One question that I know comes to mind a lot, or at least you kind of you hear it as a criticism of Polkadot in some ways, is the economic model is, right, you need to own dots to connect to the relay chain, right? And, you know, some people say, well, if it's so expensive, you know, might people just use a Kusama or something else instead? Why will people buy dots to connect to this main chain? And how do you think about that? How do you address that?
Well, ultimately, we don't know what it's going to cost to connect as a parachain to the Polkadot network. First of all, it is an issue of supply versus demand, and the amount of parachain slots that may be available may well exceed demand, or they may well be less than demand, and that's going to dictate the price. I do recognize that DOT as an asset has appreciated quite a lot, but you know, I think projects are going to move to potentially chains like Kusama, or they're going to explore other features of Polkadot, such as para threads, where and this is one I'll provide a little bit of an explanation for, but I will be cognizant of time. And I think it's one of the real innovations of Polkadot. It's not going to come with the first iteration of parachains that gets launched, but it is well underway, as it shares 95% of the same code as regular parachains. But you know, the idea is you have a computer, right, that's running, let's say, 50 different apps at once, but your CPU only has 4 cores. And the way that your operating system handles that is by sort of multiplexing different processes onto different cores at different times. So the idea of para threads as opposed to parachains is that you can have what are essentially on-demand blockchains. Many applications don't need to author a block every 6 seconds. They might need to author a block once every 10 minutes, once every hour, once every week, once every day, and can just pay on demand for those times when they need the block space. And they can do that by issuing tokens and having tokenomic issuance curves based on certain things to incentivize collators to include those blocks. Well, I'm getting a little too much into the weeds here. The core principle is that there are going to be ways to connect to the Polkadot network without securing an entire parachain slot to your project.
Got it. Cool. Well, really appreciate the time, Robert. A lot of really interesting stuff, and really appreciate the work you're doing. I guess, let me see, maybe we could have one more question if there, someone asked, which I think is a good question that, we've seen over the course of crypto that people don't really want to vote, right? So the question is, how do you overcome voter apathy in Polkadot? And I think that the governance module is really kind of designed for that, right? Which you've kind of explained, but I don't know, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's what we solve with the adaptive quorum biasing technique, where we essentially weight the threshold needed to pass things by the amount of turnout, but we also allow the council to set the default. So for things like the runtime upgrades for doing forkless upgrades, the council might sort of pre-approve this thing, and if the dot holders as a whole didn't want it, they could vote it out quite easily. But if none of the dot holders for the regular referendum showed up, the runtime upgrade would still proceed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, adaptive quorum biasing is something I haven't checked in on lately, but I've read a lot about it. I know there's good documentation on I think the Polkadot site, and I think that's an important concept that's worth people diving in. So I would encourage people interested to check out the documentation further, because it is kind of a bit complicated, but it's well laid out. So cool, Robert. Well, thanks, man. Appreciate it. Good chatting with you. And
yeah, good talking with you. Thanks for having me.